National development. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and therefore members are attending in person in the room as well as remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of members and our witness. Before speaking, please do wait until I recognize you by name. For those who are participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please do mute yourselves when you are not speaking. You may speak in the official language of your choice. Although this room is equipped with a powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause, I would remind all the members, of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. A reminder that all comments should be directed through the chair. With regards to a speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do the best we can to maintain consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they are participating virtually or in person. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I'm informing the committee members that all witnesses appearing virtually have completed the required connection tests in advance of our meeting. Now, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motions adopted by the committee on Monday, January 31st, 2022, and Tuesday, May 30th, 2023, the committee resumes its study of the situation at the Russia-Ukraine border and implications for peace and security. I would now like to welcome our witness. We have before us Dr. Jeffrey Wood, who is a professor at Western University. Thank you very much for appearing before us, Dr. Wood. We're very, very grateful. You will be provided 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will proceed to take questions from the members.
Thank you. Thank you. I would just start by a very big picture point of view, and then I'll focus down on some very specific issues. The first is, we always talk about events. And however, most events one has to deal with in the world are events that have been repeatedly those of the human experience. I'll give you an example. Recessions, depressions, wars. They may be unwelcome, but there's a lot of experience before in the world of dealing with them. One knows the outcomes. But obviously, across the world now, we're dealing with events that do transcend past human experience, like climate change. And as you're all conscious, the range of consequences are enormous, or even global pandemics and unrelated knock-on issues. Now, what this means is when it comes to crises like Ukraine, the effects are greatly amplified because of the unusual times we are in. I'll give you an example. In the 1980s, there were periodic crop failures in the former Soviet Union, and yet there wasn't the risk of mass starvation in the world there is these days. So there's a lot more vulnerability in the global system. Or take the issue of Russian oil and gas exports. We are in a long energy transition. We know as oil and gas usage is going up, portion of energy mix is declining. Now, the last time we were in a long energy transition was the early 20th century. And how it played out, it fundamentally rearranged the global deck chairs and led to a great deal of insecurity, depression, and war. So again, one can see about the implication of effects. What is particularly obviously concerning today is the Ukrainian war seems to have entered a long period of stalemate. And with political developments potentially in the coming couple of years, which we can potentially but anticipate, including south of the border, this does impart a further layer of uncertainty. So to sum up, we have a situation where because of great structural changes in today's world, the effects of crises are greatly amplified. Crises that would obviously have previously had serious effects, the effects are greatly amplified. The food security implications are much greater than would have been 30 years ago.
The interpretation, for at least a minute, the interpretation is not working.
Is there an issue on Dr.
I think the quality.
Apologies, Dr. Wood. We're just checking with the technicians. Evidently, there's some connectivity problems on your end. So if you just give us a couple of minutes, we'd be grateful.
No problem.
We'll just suspend for 2 minutes. Resume our meeting in the study of the situation at the Russia-Ukraine border and implications for peace and security. I'd like to welcome our two witnesses. First, we have with us Mr. Mark Winfield, who is a professor at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. He's joining us from Toronto. And from the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, we have Mr. Joe Calnan, who is the manager of the Energy Security Forum and is, of course, joining us from Calgary. We're very, very grateful that you could join us. You will each be provided 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will go to the members for any questions that they wish to pose to you. I would just ask, since you are doing this virtually, that you do look at the screen, and when you're very close to your time limit, I will hold this up, and I'd be grateful if you do see that sign, if you wrap up your remarks as soon as possible. And that's not only for your opening remarks, it's also in response to questions put to you by the members as well. So we will start with you, Mr. Winfield. You have 5 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very grateful to have the opportunity to appear before you today. I would have rather have been there in person too, but the logistics were not going to work. So I'm going to dive right in and just note that the unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 and the subsequent war are likely the most significant exogenous event we've seen affecting global energy markets and supplies really since the 1970s. The most prominent elements have been the shutdown of Russian natural gas and oil supplies to Western Europe as a result of a combination of sanctions and embargoes. And this, among other things, has shattered European assumptions that economic ties to Russia, particularly via energy, would make a war of precisely what's happened in Ukraine impossible. These developments do have major implications for energy and climate policy in Europe and North America. For Europe, this has raised major questions around energy security, geopolitical risks associated with non-endogenous energy sources, and challenges around climate policy and energy transitions. North America is less affected in energy security terms, but there are other outcomes there as well. The European response has been twofold. One was a very short-term effort to secure supplies, particularly of liquid natural gas from international markets, and also to retain and marginally expand the roles of coal and to a lesser extent nuclear. In the longer term, the intention is to double down on the existing energy transition or in the theme of decarbonization and emphasize the roles of renewables and energy efficiency. That's partially because these are energy sources that are not subject to geopolitical risk. From Canada's perspective, we have drawn considerable interest and pressure from our U.S., European, and Asian allies as a potential geopolitically secure provider of primary resource commodities, particularly liquid natural gas, critical minerals, and to a lesser extent, hydrogen. In looking at this, I'm going to sort of look at it through two potential lenses. One is the capacity to actually make significant contributions, and the second being around the nature of the trade-offs and the risks from a climate, environmental, economic, and indigenous reconciliation perspective that might be associated with those pathways. Around fossil fuels, part of the problem here in the short term is there is no real export capacity for oil, natural gas, or hydrogen for that matter to Europe. All of the routes for natural gas and oil run through the United States. There are pipeline infrastructure projects underway, notably the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the Coastal Gas Link, which might provide some export capacity, although those are very clearly oriented towards Asia. It's also important to keep in mind that European interest in LNG and fossil fuels is likely short-term. The long-term plan is decarbonization focused on renewables, and that may mean that there isn't much of a market to justify major infrastructure investments on Canada's side. Similar questions around hydrogen, whether is there an economic rationale for hydrogen production in Canada and then export to Europe, and it may be much more efficient to do electrolysis in Europe. There is interest around critical minerals, although these markets are very fluid, and what role Canada will actually play at a global scale is still unclear. Battery technologies and chemistries are also changing very rapidly in relation to electric vehicles, and the timelines for development of major new mineral projects, regardless of what happens with the Impact Assessment Act, are going to be long. In terms of the key trade-offs, fossil fuel export options, which is basically BC liquid natural gas and oil sands oil, are very carbon intensive, and major export increases would raise questions about ability to meet climate targets. The current plans would rely very heavily on carbon capture and storage, in both for fossil, natural, and also around hydrogen as well. There are ongoing debates about the effectiveness and costs of that. Around critical minerals, new extractive projects would be very high impact. Much of the resources are in the Boreal and Hudson's Bay, James Bay lowlands. These are globally significant carbon sink and storage sites, and also globally significant biodiversity sites as well. And there would also be major implications in these regions for indigenous people and around reconciliation. So I think there are a lot of sort of trade-offs potentially in this conversation for Canada that we will want to think through very, very carefully, as the situation remains also very fluid in terms of how energy markets are going to shake out in the long term. Thank you.
Mr. Winfield. We now go to Mr. Calnan. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Mr. Chair, members, thank you for the invitation to appear today. In my opening remarks, I would like to emphasize that it is in Canada's national interest to support our allies and our European and Asian partners by providing them with access to Canadian energy. Europe has been the primary target of Russian economic warfare through the manipulation of energy supplies and will require further assistance over the coming decades, not only to ensure that Ukraine wins this war, but also to enable the reconstruction and integration of Ukraine into the European Union. If Europe fails to do so, in part because of our lack of support, the resulting Russian victory will undermine the international rules-based order which Canadian security and trade depends on. I would like to underline 3 important points concerning Canada's role in the global energy system. First, Canada is a firmly established player in the international supply of many fuels, including uranium, natural gas, and of course, oil. Our role in the security of the global energy system is often masked by our broad energy integration with the United States, but our influence will become more visible upon the introduction of major new energy export facilities in British Columbia. Second, notwithstanding Canada's strong role in maintaining global energy security, the federal government can do more to assist the European Union in its Repower EU plan and eliminate the influence of Russian fuels in Europe's energy systems. And third, though Canada has a variety of policy options to assist projects meant to support Europe, Canadian foreign policy priorities do not guide private investment decisions. That being said, the Canadian federal government has historically played a central role in improving the economics of strategic projects meant to further Canadian national interests. These points are highly relevant when discussing Canada's future role in supplying energy to Europe. Turning to the current situation in Europe, we should note that the European Union has proven to be unexpectedly resilient to cutoffs of Russian energy. We underestimated Europe's ability to adapt to sudden shocks and its commitment to reduce its energy usage in response to the crisis, as seen in its dramatic decline in natural gas consumption. In sustaining much of the direct impact of Russia's economic war with the West, the countries of the European Union have demonstrated a deep resolve to defend Ukrainians from Russian aggression and to safeguard the international rules-based order. This resolve has come at a cost. The European Union's economic recovery from the pandemic has slowed dramatically as a result of the energy price spike. Energy price uncertainty has led energy-intensive industries in Europe to shift investment elsewhere. NATO's European members currently face the daunting prospect of helping ensure Russia's defeat in Ukraine, followed by Ukrainian reconstruction and integration into the European Union, while undergoing persistent economic stagnation. How can we assist our allies in Europe? To an extent, Canada is already helping. Current Canadian energy supplies provide a powerful buffer against supply disruptions for many fuels and critical minerals. Canada exports nearly as much oil to the United States as Russia exported to Europe prior to the beginning of the war. That being said, the federal government can and should encourage the Canadian energy industry to do more, including on the supply of oil, liquefied natural gas or LNG, critical minerals, and hydrogen. The future of Canada's support for Europe depends on infrastructure and initiative. Canada has the resources required to meet Europe's needs, but these resources are far from where they are needed. For example, a major complication for LNG export out of the East Coast is a lack of pipeline infrastructure connecting Canada's natural gas grid to the Maritimes. Efforts by the federal government to connect the Maritime provinces with our gas grid could come with a triple benefit of improving local energy security, enabling the phase-out of coal-fired power stations, and improving the case for LNG export. Canada has a long history of federal support for nation-building infrastructure. Our resources can again be marshaled in support of our allies and partners on the other side of the Atlantic. All we need is the will. Thank you again, and looking forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kalnan. We now go to the members for questions. The first member up is MP Hoback. You have 5 minutes for the first round.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here this afternoon. I'm going to start off with you, Mr. Kalman. You made some interesting statements at the very end there about Canada's ability to actually react and fulfill the requirements in the marketplace. In light of what's going on in the Middle East, if we see an escalation of that war, how much more would Canada be required to come onto the world scene to fulfill any voids?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And regarding your question, there are significant risks associated with the current conflict in the Middle East. There's currently many analysts considering the possible impact of ramped up sanctions, or the ramped up enforcement of sanctions, on Iran. This would occur in case there's a northern front opening for Israel, in which case there may be ramped up sanctions on the export of oil from Iran, which is currently facing secondary sanctions from the United States. However, the full enforcement of these sanctions has been relaxed somewhat over the last few years as efforts have been made to improve improve relations between the United States and Iran. However, there are, pardon?
Is it fair to say then that there is some risk there? Definitely, it's definitely priced risk. And
certainly,
again, we've done nothing in the last 4 years or 8 years to alleviate any of that risk. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that is fair to say. Currently, there's around 2.1 million barrels per day of Iranian oil exports that are subject to these sanctions, but are currently being exported nevertheless. If this oil is taken off the market, then there would be substantial impact on global energy prices and likely tip the world into global recession. Exactly. However, the possibility of this happening is slim due to the major economic impacts that would likely occur.
So again, if we look at Iran, and Iran's being a major culprit in what's going on in the Middle East and maybe providing arms for Russia, I think that's fairly well proven too. That money that's made from the oil that's being shipped out of Iran is actually being used against Ukraine and used against Israel at this point in time. Is that fair to say?
Certainly, you could say that the current exports of oil from Iran are supporting the Iranian regime and for sure providing opportunity to support Russia in its war in Ukraine. Although there are major questions about whether Iran would be doing so anyway if the full pressure sanctions were put on it again.
Fair enough, but then if you look at it, if Canada was able to actually increase its capacity to get oil to Tidewater, instead of just shipping it to the U.S., we could displace that and actually create a scenario where it's not as reliant on Iran or other countries for their actual requirements. Is that fair to say? And that would definitely impact back into Europe, right?
Yes, I'd say that the Trans Mountain expansion, which will provide another around 690,000 barrels per day into kind of the Pacific market, could provide a good relief valve for this cutoff of exports from Iran. However, this wouldn't completely patch the hole. And in terms of short-term infrastructure requirements that would be required in this front, it would be more likely that Saudi Arabia steps in to manage the loss of production from Iran. However, there are also concerns there around the possible role of the Houthi insurgency in Yemen, which has previously attacked Saudi Arabian oil infrastructure. And there's a possibility that something like that could happen again if Iran chose to escalate this into a more regional conflict.
So it's fair to say Europe could have a fairly cold winter if some things go wrong. Is that fair to say?
In terms of home heating in Europe, Europe currently has
as far as energy requirements.
Pardon me?
I'm looking more at energy requirements. I just use the slang cold, but.
Well, certainly there would be major issues where it comes to the supply of oil to Europe if something like this happened. So yes, Yes, there would be issues around the world. However, since Iran primarily exports its oil to China, I think China would be the most heavily impacted right off the bat.
Okay. If we look at, I come from Saskatchewan, nuclear energy.
Sorry, Mr. O'Leary, it is 5 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you. We now go to MP Chattel. You have 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Yes. So, last winter, at the very beginning of last winter, we were very concerned for Europe that they'd be able to heat themselves. They got through a difficult period. Europeans are resilient, we can say that. They're very resilient. 1 year later, we're once again faced with energy security, as my colleagues were saying. Winter is getting closer and it's always a concern. It's still a concern. I'd like to hear you speak to the situation compared to last year in Europe. Have they succeeded in finding alternative sources, alternative energies?
Sorry, I believe I'll take that question. Yes, Europe has in fact succeeded in finding alternative sources for both natural gas and oil, and to an equal extent, I suppose, coal, although coal isn't as important of a component of Europe's energy system anymore, now that on a wide basis, coal has been phased out as a major energy source in Europe. It is still a significant energy source, and we have seen that Europe began to draw on the coal markets of Kazakhstan and South Africa last year. But in terms of the oil and natural gas situation, Europe has become much more heavily dependent on the Middle East in terms of its supply of both liquefied natural gas, especially, and oil. It does not receive the European Union, most countries in the European Union, sorry, I should say, there are still a few countries that are holdouts on this front, do not receive any natural gas or oil through pipelines or shipments or overseas shipments from Russia. There is still a substantial role for Russian LNG, however, in Europe's energy imports. Russia, I believe.
Merci. Ma question.
Thank you. My question, in fact, is also about security and independence in regards to energy in Europe, the advancements in that sector. What, perhaps Mr. Winfield, you could comment.
Yes. I think it's important to separate in Europe the relatively short-term responses about getting through last winter and this coming winter, which put a very strong emphasis on accessing, particularly liquid natural gas wherever they get their hands on it, and they're quite successful at that. In the longer term, the Europeans are quite clear about their emphasis on renewables and their emphasis on the energy efficiency side, because I think they're very sensitive to the question of substituting one geopolitically risky energy source in Russia for another, particularly in the Middle East or anywhere else. So I think it's very important to look at the European approach in both sort of the sort of immediate crisis management that has taken place around supplies, and then the longer term picture of where things are going in the energy transition. And they're also still, in Europe's case, the convergence between decarbonization and energy security is very, very strong.
Merci. Et à l'approche, justement.
Thank you. With that transition, to pick up on the energy transition for Europe, I'd really like to know, in your opinion, how can Canada position itself to be an economic partner in the energy strategy for Europe?
There are multiple dimensions to that, and although we're in a conversation, I think, about what that really looks like. I mean, the Europeans have expressed interest in hydrogen, for example, although I think there are some questions there about the economics of that. We've seen the Europeans also very interested in critical minerals. So we saw that very much in Ms. van der Leyen's visit. Again, complications I indicated in my opening statement, particularly relative to other global suppliers. So we need to think, how much do we want to be put in the role of a primary resource commodity provider versus more value-added types of contributions on the European side.
Merci.
And we have to be conscious of trade-offs domestically as well.
Oui, je pense qu'on doit avoir les deux. Je suis d'accord avec vous. On peut pas juste.
Thank you. I think we need to have both. We can't just have natural resources leaving our country. We need to do processing here. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MP Chattel. We now go to MP Caron. You have 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to both of our witnesses for being here today. I'll start with you, Mr. Winfield. You talked about LNG and its importance for Europe in the very short term, but you also highlighted that it's not a solution for energy security for the European Union in the long term necessarily. We've also learned from witnesses that Canada is not yet equipped with the essential infrastructure that would allow us in the short term to ensure that there is better energy security for Europe with LNG. Of course, I'm a member for Quebec. I know that Quebec, among others, has expertise in hydroelectricity, in renewable energy, in wind energy. And furthermore, in Ukraine, there's solar energy infrastructure that's been destroyed. Does Canada just have oil and gas to offer for the energy transition? Is that all we are as a country, or do we have more to offer for the long-term transition?
No, I think we have much more to offer. I mean, particularly in Quebec, there is, for example, very long established expertise around energy storage and particularly battery technologies is one area of particular note. And as you also note, we have also been very successful in increasing the large-scale integration of intermittent renewables, but also in the management and balancing of those, particularly in Quebec's experience with hydroelectric storage infrastructure. So there is expertise in multiple dimensions of this that Canada can contribute to this conversation. And indeed, those may turn out to be the more value-added components on the engineering and system management components, as opposed to just being a commodity resource provider in that process.
Merci beaucoup. Et,
Thank you very much. You mentioned that given that Europe was going to double down, it's going to accelerate its energy transition. For LNG from Canada, we didn't necessarily have a stable and sure market for the long term. If I look at Repsol, a Spanish company that owns a terminal in LNG in St. John's, these people announced that exporting LNG from the terminal to Europe was not a viable project. In Canada, we've had Trans Mountain. We have that pipeline that's cost $30 billion in public money. Are we not using the situation in Europe to justify infrastructure to transport fossil fuels that will lead to losses that will be bad long-term investments for the Canadian economy and our companies?
I think there's an interesting conversation around this for sure. That we certainly have heard lots of voices pushing that we should be sort of increasing commodity exports, particularly of fossil fuels. As you highlight with natural gas, that's a challenge. We don't have any eastwards export capacity. There's, what happens is it actually goes down through the United States to the Gulf Coast if it's going that way. In theory, we will have natural gas export capacity on the West Coast with Coastal GasLink and various BC LNG projects. The challenges there are those significant around the economics. The expectation is that infrastructure will serve more Asian markets than Europe. The BC LNG projects are very carbon intensive. They are from fracked natural gas as opposed to simple sweet gas. And as we've seen, there are also very significant divisions among the affected Indigenous communities around those projects as well. So this is a complicated.
Merci.
Thank you. I have 30 seconds left. I'll ask a question. A quick question to our other witness. It's a matter of curiosity. You talked about American sanctions on Iran. It exports a large part of its oil to China. Iran is part of OPEC, which controls most of the global supply. You're telling us that there's only Canada with big infrastructure projects for pipelines that could substitute what Iran would not be sending to China, that the other OPEC countries wouldn't be ready?
Respond in less than 15 seconds, please.
Well, I'd say in this circumstance, it would certainly be Saudi Arabia that would make up the shortfall because they have a significant amount of spare capacity and they've always taken their role as a balancer seriously. However, I also need to push back on the idea that OPEC controls most of the world's oil production. It does not. OPEC controls around 40% of the world oil production. A large percentage of
I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut you off, Mr. Calnan. For the next question, we go to MP McPherson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses
minutes.
for being with us today. I was quite interested, Mr. Winfield, in some of the things that you were saying with regards to our obligations with regards to climate change. And so if we were to use natural gas, that it's very carbon intensive, it doesn't necessarily adhere to UNDRIP and some of the other legislation that we have in place in this country, and that it would require an awful lot in terms of carbon capture technology to go forward. Does Canada have that carbon capture technology at this point?
I think that's a matter of some debate. Deployed on the scale that might be necessary, I think the short answer would be no. In theory, there are investments being made in that space. The challenge with LNG, especially though, is that you've got carbon emissions coming from multiple places. Part of it is at the moment, it looks like we're going to be using fossil fuels to do the liquefaction. You might be able to do CCUS there if the geology is right in the locations of British Columbia. The other problem, though, with the BC gas plays is that they rely very heavily on fracked natural gas. And the problem there is that is very hard to deal with through CCUS because what you're largely dealing with is fugitive emissions, leaks from wells, leaks from the fracking process, and there is quite a lot of concern about just how much methane, especially, is released as a result of those dimensions of development of those kinds of gas reserves. We're not talking about situations where you're just drilling a gas well and you've got a sweet gas reserve you're drilling into. This is much more complicated and much more carbon intensive in the extraction process itself as well as the processing.
And I assume extraordinarily expensive to develop these new technologies. Who, in your opinion, should be paying for the development of these technologies and the development of these resources, of this carbon capture storage?
Again, there has been, this is a matter of some debate. I would tend to lean towards that the industry, particularly given the scale of the profit margins currently in the fossil fuel sector, really should be bearing the primary cost here. I mean, that would be consistent with the principle of polluter pays. We know that substantial support is being provided through the CCUS tax credit, but that has been a matter of some controversy. Many people have raised the question of whether that's appropriate at all for a variety of reasons.
And would you consider that, in your opinion, would you consider that an oil and gas subsidy?
I would. I know the government's definition they released in the summer is very carefully configured to not, but when I talked to my classes about this, we certainly regard it as a form of subsidization of the oil and gas sector.
Thank you. Mr. Calnan, I have a question for you as well. You spoke in your testimony about us not having the infrastructure in place to provide energy to Europe, that has not been developed. And actually, you know, I was in Germany. I met with the German Chancellor, the head of the Chancellery, just last year, and they spoke about the need for short-term energy solutions for them, that they were not interested in a long-term negotiation for long-term energy because they were transitioning to renewables so rapidly as a result of the illegal invasion of Ukraine. Could you tell me how long it would take to build the resources necessary for us to get Canadian energy to Germany, to Ukraine, to other European markets?
Well, I think that depends on the political will as well as the the involvement of private sector actors. Because if you look at the original Enbridge mainline pipeline, back then it was called something else, and I'd be able to get that information to you. It took around 2 years to build the pipeline from Alberta.
Sorry to interrupt you, but you know the context that we're working in now with the different regulations we have to meet, the different provincial jurisdictions that we of course want to respect. In a 2023 situation, do you think it would take 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? If you had to guess on one of those numbers.
I do know that Germany, when it was under pressure, it built the Wilhelmshaven LNG facility in around 6 months. Now, in all the LNG facilities that were planned in Germany at the time, they were all on, say, 10 or 15-year timelines. They were able to accelerate this project. And in cases where the national interest is decided, then you can move awfully quickly.
Mr. Winfield, would you agree with that assessment that it could be done very quickly in 6 months, something like that?
No. The import infrastructure is much more straightforward in terms of regasifying the liquid natural gas. To export, I mean, there is an enormous infrastructure that has to be constructed. You've got the actual wells themselves, which mostly are northwestern British Columbia and the plays that are significant here. You then have to build the pipelines from there to the BC coast. You have to build liquefaction facilities in British Columbia as well. We're sort of starting to do that, but there's a lot to be done there. So I don't think, given the complexity, I'm not sure those kinds of timescales are really feasible around those kinds of resources.
Well, and I certainly hope that Ukraine is able to be victorious much sooner than 15 years. Thank you very much. That's all for me.
Thank you, MP McPherson. We now go to MP Abel-Taif.
Well, thanks for the witnesses for appearing this afternoon before committee. To both of you, in terms of years, what is short-term and long-term energy supply look like in terms of number of years?
Mark, would you like to go first? Or?
Sure. There's short-term and short-term. I would generally put short-term in a 5-year time frame. Longer term, we're sort of talking decade. I mean, we've also now, with Europe, we've also sort of had a very short-term time frame where they were having to deal with getting through this past winter and somewhat more structured this winter. So, you know, there are variations, but I would put short-term generally as sort of a 5-year window.
Mm-hmm. Are we talking just about Europe's energy, or are we talking about global?
No, generally speaking.
Generally speaking, well, the recent World Energy Outlook from the International Energy Agency was released, and depending on the scenario that you look at, you can have major differences in terms of what the global energy system looks like in the future. Under the STEP scenario, we see a major decline in the use of coal globally, and this is partially or majorly due to commitments made in COP26 in Glasgow to phase out the use of coal for electricity. However, oil and natural gas remain, they flatline around 2028, 2029, but remain at elevated levels of about a little bit less. For oil, it's a little bit less than 100, maybe around 97 million barrels per day of oil demand per year, or per day, sorry, right up until 2050. And that's under the STEP scenario. However, under the announced pledges scenario, you have gradually lowering demand. I believe that it goes down to around 50 million barrels per day by 2050. And under the net zero emission scenario, you have demand for oil go down to around 25 million barrels per day by 2050.
Thank you. I'm from Alberta, and the carbon capture technologies and also the the hydrogen project. Basically, it is in my electoral district. But there's very promising technologies in Alberta, has always been in the field of energy supply. And the carbon capture has been one of them. Now, short-term 5 years, long-term 10 years. I think we were looking for longer than that. 5 years for Europe now is very, very long time due to the current situation and the developments that's happening in the Middle East. The question is, how much of the 5 years can Canada do to invest in the carbon capture versus looking at other areas where we don't have any hope, such as, for example, some of the other sustainable product that might be available there. Should we only bet on a winning horse and try to invest in areas and where the government can be sitting in order to achieve this goal?
Something that I'd like to underline is that carbon capture and storage is not exclusive to oil and gas. It's actually a technology that will be required for many different forms of decarbonization. For example, the decarbonization of cement will likely involve the use of carbon capture. The decarbonization of steel is also expected to at least a certain extent be reliant on the use of carbon capture in cases where hydrogen is not an option. There are many industrial applications in which carbon capture could be very useful. So to be frank, carbon capture and storage is a very expensive technology currently. It hasn't really achieved the sort of scale that solar panels and wind turbines and other sort of other emissions reduction technologies have achieved. But that isn't to say that it can't reach that level. There's maybe around 25 years ago, it was unlikely that anybody would have the idea that electrical grid could be run off of solar, because solar panels were for satellites out in space. Very expensive, very high tech, but we achieved scale on those and were able to drive down the cost very effectively. And now they're looking like the future of our electricity grids.
Dr. Winfield would like to weigh on this.
I'm somewhat less enthusiastic about CCUS because we have not seen demonstration of anything approaching the scale that would be required to make a difference on the climate side. Cost remains a big problem. There are questions about effectiveness and how sequestered things really are. And then the other big problem is the questions of geology. You can't do this in large parts of the country. Alberta, if you're going to do CCUS, it's probably relatively well suited. Somewhere like Ontario or Quebec, geological candidates are, to put it mildly, rather more limited. So those are factors. I think I'm concerned that we've got an awful lot of eggs in the CCUS basket at the moment, and that does concern me somewhat.
I'm on all options.
Thank you. I'm afraid you're considerably over time, Mr. Abeltaif. So we now go to Mr. Zuberi. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, for bringing us together, and to the witnesses for being here today. I'll want to ask some questions around global stability and beyond Europe with respect to what's happening, for example, in Africa and Americas, and the Americas, I should say, with the current war and within the global South. In terms of energy security, how is that? What do we see in Africa and the Americas? If you can shed any light on that.
I could start off, Mark. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the related spike in the in energy prices, there were major cascading effects throughout South America and in Africa. Since many countries in both South America and Africa follow policies of subsidizing energy for their citizens, and these are very popular policies. So this would be for mainly for things like diesel, cooking oil, other aspects like that. African countries were very fiscally interested in the cheap energy. So following the invasion and the spike in the price of energy, we saw dramatic increases in the price of energy that were borne by governments, not just by individual people, but by the governments themselves. And so many of these governments came under extreme fiscal pressures. This has led to many governments nearing bankruptcy, having to approach the IMF and the World Bank for short-term loans in order to cover their losses. And the IMF specifically, I believe, has demanded fairly severe fiscal programs to cut back on these sorts of energy subsidies. And of course, whenever any of these countries cut back on these sorts of energy subsidies, they often see riots, protests in the street, and general instability. For example, in Nigeria, the government was forced to reduce fuel subsidies, and there was major instability following that, major examples of fuel theft, which were actually reducing government revenues even more, since they are a member of OPEC and they have a state-owned energy company. And so in general, these rising energy prices are, if they are bad for Europe, they're even worse for the global south.
Thank you. Mr. Winfield, if you want to add anything, feel free. If not, that's fine too.
No, I think I'm not an expert on energy matters in Africa, I would emphasize. But I do think it is important to keep in mind that the capacity of governments in Africa and certainly Latin America to cope in the way in which Europe did is much more limited. And that leads to greater political fragility, and also the capacity to undertake the kind of structural transition in energy markets that Europe is pursuing also is a huge challenge in Africa or Latin America. And as part of the reason we have issues around the loss and damage issues in relation to climate change and other issues to sort of provide capacity in the global south to try and do these, manage these kinds of transitions.
Thank you. And in the next minute and a half or so, so I'm just curious in terms of Canada's contribution and how we can help to help the world with respect to shifting to cleaner energy and renewable energy. Do you have any insights on what we can provide as a country to the rest of the world when it comes to cleaner and renewable energy sources?
We have a number of areas where we have considerable expertise, although we've lost some ground, not just on energy sources, but also on the energy efficiency and energy productivity side. We've done some very interesting utilities in Atlantic Canada, of all places, who do very interesting energy efficiency work. We had quite a successful program in Ontario as well until 2019. And we have developed considerable capacities in the development, operation, design of renewable energy technologies, their large-scale operation and integration into energy systems, particularly in Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec, and to a certain degree the Maritimes as well. So we have quite a lot to offer in this space beyond raw commodity resources.
Thank you.
Sorry, if I could just jump in on that as well.
No, I'm afraid we're out of time for this round. So we will go to Mr. Garon. You have 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Winfield, I'll keep going with you. Last March, the European Parliament negotiated an agreement with the European Union Council, and they aim to have at least 42.5% of renewable energy by 2030 in Europe. And they hope to reach 45%. The Canadian strategy is to invest with public money in huge ways in CCUS, not as a last resort for steel and cement, but on a large scale so that we can increase our production in a huge way, increase our emissions, so we can export to Europe to ensure their energy security, so they say. So I look at the agreement that was negotiated in Europe. Does Canada not have a strategy that's totally out of step with Europe's? Are we not knocking on the door of the wrong client?
It's not inconceivable. I mean, the Europeans are moving very quickly and already have on very large-scale integration of renewables. You're seeing 40, 50% of energy output in major European countries coming from wind, solar, principally. There are other sources as well. And that seems to be where the Europeans strategically are heading, that they've kind of been burned, as it were, having relied on an external energy source around their transition. And so, as I say, there's a kind of convergence between climate and energy security and energy transition in Europe, which is quite different from where we're thinking about things in Canada. I mean, their perspective is very much one of a fossil fuel consumer as opposed to producer, and so that very strongly has informed their strategies. And with the additional experience of geopolitical risk around this, which is not to say, but then in Canada, our dynamics are different, but the need to decarbonize is just as imperative. And as I've said, I do worry we've got an awful lot of eggs in the CCUS basket, and for a variety of reasons that raises some very significant risks in my mind.
Sorry, could I jump in here? Just
very briefly, in less than
Yes,
15
yes.
seconds.
Yes, just to comment on the outlook for European energy. Shell, I believe Total, Shell, and Eni have all signed 27-year agreements to procure Qatari natural gas, LNG, from 2026, which will bring them beyond 2050 in terms of importing LNG. So the idea that natural gas will be completely absent from Europe's energy systems past 2050 is not true.
Thank you, Mr. Calnan. We next go to MP McPherson. You have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm going to follow up on some of the questions that my colleague, Mr. Zuberi, asked. Canada has a $5.3 billion international climate finance commitment, which supports developing countries that are, and I quote, hardest hit by climate change. And it includes a thematic focus on clean energy transition and coal phase out. Mr. Winfield, perhaps I'll start with you. How effectively do you think that Canadian international assistance is addressing energy insecurity in developing countries, knowing that the guardrails here are clean energy transition and coal phase out?
I would have to admit that this is somewhat beyond my immediate area of expertise in terms of where the international assistance has been going. In general, one would expect the investments to emphasize relatively distributed resources because they're appropriate in scale and capital intensity and responding to the energy needs in those sorts of locations. It makes sense to be doing household and community level things as opposed to large centralized infrastructures, I think, in many contexts.
Thank you. And you also spoke a little bit about the fact that there's been this massive transition in Europe as a result of the weaning off Russian energy, I guess. This question is actually for you, Mr. Calnan. Do you find it strange that there's a massive transition to renewables in Europe, a massive transition to renewables in our development dollars, and yet in Alberta, we have put a pause on renewables? Do you find that incongruent in any way?
I don't tend to comment on more political matters, but I'd say that there's nothing that by nature there's no logical incoherence in having both a country that has a significant amount of renewables in its energy system, as well as being a major energy exporter in the form of hydrocarbons. Norway, for example, is one of the most advanced countries in the world in terms of decarbonization, and yet it is a major and very strong exporter of both natural gas and oil.
Of course, they also haven't paused renewables, though, have they? But thank you.
No, they have not.
For this round, members are provided 4 minutes, and we start off with MP Chong.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. In March of 2022, Minister Wilkinson, in response to the energy crisis resulting from Russia's invasion of Ukraine a month earlier, agreed to incrementally increase oil and gas exports by, in 2022, by 300,000 barrels a day equivalent, 200,000 of which was oil, 100,000 barrels of which was natural gas, in order to displace gas from authoritarian states like the Russian Federation. At the time, industry experts, industry executives in Alberta indicated that they could easily double that number if required, that the pipeline capacity and the production capacity was there to do that, to 600,000 barrels. I note that in 2022, at the same time, President Biden authorized the release of 217 million barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which works out to about 600,000 barrels a day. This year, in effect, the administration turned a blind eye. It was a deliberate policy. It's been widely reported on in the New York Times and Washington Post. The administration turned a blind eye to the sanctions on Iran beginning in late December last year throughout this year that allowed Iran to increase its oil production by some 700,000 barrels of oil a day. Now that that's coming to an end because of what's happening in the Middle East, the Biden administration announced last week, Wednesday, that it had lifted sanctions, issued a permit through the Treasury Department, lifting sanctions on Venezuela to produce what is expected to be about 200,000 barrels of oil a day going forward. Do you not think that Canada should be supplying these barrels of oil to our closest trading partner and ally in lieu of either the SPR releases, the lifting of sanctions on a pretty brutal regime in Venezuela, and the turning a blind eye to increased output from the Islamic Republic of Iran? That's my question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yes, I'll comment on that. For sure, certainly the issue of the United States relations with energy between Canada and the United States is a major issue for Canada, which is part of why the Trans Mountain Pipeline is very important for Canadian national interests going forward. Not to say that the United States isn't our best friend, but you shouldn't rely on your best friend for everything. With the example of the Keystone XL pipeline, which was how do I put this? It was stopped by the Biden administration on the first day in office. I'd say that at this point.
Yeah, I guess my question is, industry executives said at the time, in March of 2022, that they could easily double up exports of oil and gas under existing pipeline and production capacity from 300,000 to more than 600,000 incremental barrels of oil a day equivalent. So my question is, should we have not, as a country, worked with our closest trading partner and ally to supply them with those incremental barrels instead of them having to drain the SPR or appeal to, or go to Iran and Venezuela for these incremental barrels? That's my question.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I have the information on why we did not increase production by that much.
Because we don't control production in that way. I mean, if there's market there, then and capacity to export, then material, the commodities exported.
Thank you.
I would just say that Mr. Wilkinson did interfere in the market in that way to allow for these 300,000 incremental barrels of oil a day equivalent in order to respond in March of 2022 to the
Mr.
European
Chong,
energy
it's
crisis.
over 4 minutes. Thank you. We now go to Mr. Oliphant. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for helping us with this study early on. Also want to thank the analysts for the notes for this meeting, which I found very helpful. I'm putting my old accountant hat on for today. A second time in a week, it's scary. I want to start by saying I'm proud of Canada as an energy producer. I'm equally proud and convinced that we can become a green country with a lower carbon footprint while we produce energy for the world. I am pro-pipeline against other forms of transportation. I am pro-helping Ukraine beat Russia in the current conflict, and I am pro-helping Europe with their energy problem. All of that being said, I want to follow up on Mr. Guérin's questions around the business case. I am actually profoundly a free market person. And when he talked about the Spanish company Repsol making a decision to not continue announce that exporting LNG from the terminal to Europe is not a viable project, it made me look at the whole issue of the business cases that are involved here. So a question is, what do you believe the business case is for private sector expansion of energy, given our also goals as a society to have a greener future?
Well, that's a complicated question, and part of the challenge, of course, is governments are intervening still very aggressively in support of fossil fuels and subsidizing in multiple different directions. So I think there's remains embedded policy contradictions in terms of where we're going. And we're not necessarily leaving that to the marketplace. We are intervening quite significantly still in favor of fossil fuels. I mean, the estimates on the extent of subsidization of the fossil fuel sector in Canada vary. I see figures anywhere from $3 to $4 billion to $18 billion a year, depending on how you count. And some people would count Trans Mountain on top of that. So to come back to the LNG stuff, there have been persistent questions about the economic rationale. Certainly going east, it doesn't seem to work, very simply.
If I could,
west is trickier. Yes.
On that, I mean, I'm really struggling with the business case because it was also mentioned the profits that energy companies have been reaping, particularly since the higher inflated prices, and where that profit is being held. Is it being used for the good of Canada? And are they investing in infrastructure, as I believe they should be engaged in the investing of their own infrastructure? Where is the profit levels? Are they making money? Are we subsidizing? And why would we want to subsidize further to help when actually the markets may not be there?
I think these are very good questions. Certainly the sector is very, the fossil fuel sector at the moment is very, very profitable. And yes, there's certainly very good questions about the targeting of government support and subsidies and where that is taking us and what sort of pathways it may be embedding.
Sorry, could I jump in here as well? I feel as though the treatment of the Canada's energy industry, and in particular oil and gas, the treatment of calculations of subsidies doesn't really take into account the fact that it operates under kind of a fundamentally different tax system than most businesses in Canada. And this is in particular where it comes to the taxation of like the royalty taxation that provinces impose upon energy industry and the energy industry, which is a fairly substantial portion of provincial incomes. And this is especially in Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland and Labrador. Royalty.
I'm afraid you're out of time, Mr. Calnan. Bienvenue, Monsieur Trudel.
Welcome, Mr. Trudel. You have 2 minutes. I don't share the optimism of my Liberal colleague regarding Canada's energy policy and the policy of the Conservatives, which they must have stated earlier. There's an article in Le Devoir that says that there are 38 million American dollars in subsidies, that was in 2022, to fossil fuels. And it's from the IMF. Most of that is costs due to air pollution and the climate crisis. Even though we think we're going to hit a peak in energy demand for fossil fuels in the next decade, there are still huge investments in an energy of the past. How would you explain the fact that there are still huge investments, Mr. Winfield? The 5 large oil companies in 2022 made $200 billion in profits. Why does Canada continue to invest so much money in an industry of the past?
I think that's a good question. I mean, my political scientist answer in part is that they are institutionally embedded incumbents. and have very close relationships with some provincial governments as well. But I think the underlying question is very valid in terms of, particularly in the context of commitments around climate change and energy transitions. The continued subsidization of the fossil fuel sector is one that begs an awful lot of questions. There are debates about how you do this, how you account for that, and one also has to keep in mind the sort of visible subsidies are only part of this. As we've been being reminded in Alberta, there is also this question of accumulated liabilities over abandoned wells and things like that have to be taken into account as well, because it's unclear how that's going to be covered other than ultimately through the taxpayers of Alberta. So we have to keep a very broad perspective on the different forms of subsidization and support that may occur to a sector, and indeed the ones that may be most visible may not actually be the most important.
Many experts say, oh, sorry.
We go to Madam McPherson. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. I'm just going to reiterate that I feel like, as my colleague Mr. Oliphant has said, the math just doesn't add up. We don't have the infrastructure in place. We simply don't. We can't overlook the fact that attempts to get that infrastructure in place have cost Albertans a lot. Jason Kenney wasted $1.5 billion on a bet that that the KXL pipeline would go through. We're also seeing the industry laying off workers. Like right now, Suncor has laid off 1,500 workers in our sector, despite the fact that they have massive profits and they continue to increase their outputs. So yeah, absolutely. If we had Energy East, if we had the capacity to do this, I think there would be a real argument for it. But so far today, I've heard nothing that has changed my mind. We are living in a climate crisis. We have laws in this country like UNDRIP. We have a provincial jurisdiction. We are a federated system. So this whole conversation, which was supposed to be a conversation about how to help Ukraine, despite the fact that it has very little to do with Ukraine today, I think is problematic because Canada isn't in a position right now to help Ukraine. And we can look back and why we should have been in a different position than we are in. But Mr. Winfield, is there any rationale for us to be thinking that Canadian energy is a solution to help Ukraine at this point that I'm missing?
The question of how to help Ukraine is a complicated and broad one. At this stage of the game, I would tend to suggest that the energy dimension of things, given the numbers we're talking about, are still very small portions of total global energy supply in terms of oil, for example. Probably where Canada can help Ukraine the most is in other spheres. Diplomatic and otherwise, as I'm increasingly concerned that we're not paying enough attention to what is happening in Ukraine and the situation on the ground there, because of developments in other parts of the world and other places. But that's a very broad answer. But I would not argue that the energy dimension of things is the most central thing we can do in terms of supporting Ukraine at this stage.
Thank you, Professor Winfield. So for the final round, each member is provided 4 minutes, with the exception of Mr. Trudell and Madam McPherson, 2 minutes each. And we start off with MP Epp. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here.
Could I just ask how long we're going?
This is the final round.
But we were going to 6:30. Did the committee already agree to go longer?
Well, this is going to take 10 minutes, but because there were all sorts of delays.
But we also have other commitments.
So members don't want to do a final round?
I'd prefer not to.
About Ukraine at all.
I'm willing to go.
I don't think we should.
I think it's scheduled to finish at 6:30. I would like to finish on schedule.
Yeah.
Everyone, okay.
There's 4 minutes.
Yes, Mr. Chung.
No?
Mr. Chung?
Maybe you should. Mr. Chair, why don't we just give a round to the members who haven't had a chance to talk, who wish to talk?
That was my initial intention, but it seems that the other members are not in agreement. So
just till the clock runs out at 6:30. So we have
it
3
is
minutes
already
left.
Mr. Chong, it is already 6:30?
No, it's 6:27.
Like, I'm looking at the clock.
I'm
right
happy to
ahead
give
of me.
Mr. Epp 3 minutes, even though on principle I don't.
Okay,
because usually
Mr.
we
Epp,
balance.
you get 4 minutes, since that's what I initially said.
Thank you,
4
Mr.
minutes.
Chair, and thank you to the committee for allowing me this opportunity. Because Canada was not in a position
no, and then you
or
say
chose not to fill some of the void created with Russia's invasion, sources then were secured out of Qatar, Venezuela, and other places. Obviously, I think we all know the geopolitical risk that's associated there, particularly now with Hamas's actions in Israel, et cetera, and the risks that could be increased there. Professor Winfield, I'm going to go back to your opening statement, and if I heard you correctly, you stated that when Europe goes, continues its path or goes back to its decarbonization process, that there was no geopolitical risk in that process. And that I find, I want to challenge that statement. Obviously, you identified nuclear, EV would be part of that whole transition. Where are those critical minerals coming from? Is there no geopolitical risk in sourcing them from Africa or other places? I find that a bit of an incredulous statement.
Well, I didn't say there would be no geopolitical risk. I said that the European Union is very sensitive to the questions of geopolitical risk around energy supplies and other things. The approach around material flows in Europe is very interesting. We actually just published this week a study on electric vehicle batteries, mostly on end-of-life questions. And one of the things, again, that's quite interesting with the European Union is the emphasis on circularity, on recovering materials from end-of-life batteries, for example, and feeding them back into supply chains within Europe, precisely because they are sensitive to these risks. I mean, all of these things are ultimately internationally traded commodities. And that is part of the source of the risk. I mean, we have a particular example of the war in Ukraine, but other factors can go at work which affect the prices of particularly minerals, for example, that are also beyond the control of the
Thank you. I do want to get one other.
They're being very, yeah, okay. Sorry.
I do want to get one other question in, and that I'll go to Mr. Callan. I mean, obviously China is a factor is big in that other question, but Mr. Callan, if I can go somewhere else, you also mentioned that Europe was able to decline. There was a rapid decline in their use of natural gas. Was that substituted from other energy sources, or did they simply go without?
In some cases, it was substituted. For example, they were able to substitute natural gas for diesel, or diesel for natural gas or coal. But in many other cases, it just implied a reduction in industrial output in particularly. Most of the declines in natural gas consumption in Europe were from industrial production. And that's mainly because the many European countries were subsidizing households for their own natural gas consumption and effectively supporting the market for households at the expense of industry.
Which hurt their economy. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Questioning, Mr. Rapp?
You give me 3 minutes, right?
4 minutes I gave you. I leave it to you.
Thank you very much. Just the overall question, if our infrastructure would have been in place, how much could Canada have helped? Both our European allies and also Japan has also come calling. Mr. Callan, please.
Well, it depends on how much infrastructure we're assuming here, I suppose. If we're talking about achieving the level of oil sands production that some people were talking about 30, 40 years ago, then certainly Canada would be one of the largest producers of oil in the world. Well, we already are one of the largest producers of oil, but we could be producing far more. In terms of natural gas, we don't have the same sort of natural gas reserves as the United States or Russia have, but we do have a significant amount of natural gas that could have been more LNG facilities on the West Coast certainly could have been approved. They were approved, but the economics of them wasn't quite there to allow for all of them to go through. But the economics of projects is highly influenced by all sorts of factors, the cost of pipelines and regulatory factors, and many different things go into the economics of whether a project will go forward. So yes, Canada could have been helping a lot more if the question of whether we could have completely replaced Russia, I don't think that that was ever really in the cards, but certainly Canada could have helped more.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rapp. At this point, allow me to thank our two witnesses, Mr. Winfield and Mr. Callan. Thank you very, very much for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. Now, if members of the committee are in agreement, can we adjourn the committee? Thank you. We will. This meeting stands adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.